Welcome to our seminar today on modern slavery. It's great to have you all here with us, and from so many different areas of the world as well, which is great to see some people here from Australia, from Africa, here in the UK as well. So welcome everybody, it's great to have you here. These seminar series are being recorded, and this set of series of seminars are all sponsored by Avetta, and we'll be sending you the links to all of our recordings, this one and the others in case you missed it, from next week. So we want this session to be as interactive as possible. It's great to see you all chatting away on the chat there, and don't forget to submit your questions to our panelists later through the Q&A box. If you can do it through the Q&A box rather than the chat, and that just leaves me only one place to look out for them so they don't get missed. And make sure you get in there nice and early as well. Often people think of things at the last minute and we just don't get round to answering them. So it would be great to get you involved with this as we go along. So make sure you chat and make some connections with other people. But we're here to talk about modern slavery, and I'm joined here by Mike Ford at Avetta. Welcome, Mike.
Good morning, Emma.
Great to have you here, and thank you to Avetta for sponsoring this series of seminars for us. Tell me a little bit about Avetta, Mike, and the role you do there.
Great. Well, my role is I'm the global lead for sustainability in EHS. I've got quite a diverse background. I started in health and safety and moved into human rights. And my role now working within Avetta is a company that specializes in undertaking supply chain risk and due diligence. And we work within about 34 sectors globally. We have about 180,000 suppliers within our network who work across these networks. And we predominantly work with sustainability and procurement professionals, helping them identify the inherent type of risk that you can gain when you import suppliers, whether that be materials or whether that be contract labor.
And I guess the modern slavery is high on everyone's agenda, really, and particularly with the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, similar act in Australia. There's talk of one in New Zealand, throughout Europe, bits in the US as well. Do you think that procurement teams are still struggling to get a handle on how to address modern slavery in their supply chain, and perhaps still looking at it from a compliance point of view, really, rather than a good governance?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the Act was a good thing. The UK led the world at the time, and I think other countries have introduced their own legislation, in my view, have done a better job of it, if I'm honest. We've been a little bit timid in the language that we use, and we've had 5 years, and I know it's extended the scope slightly. But I think one of the issues I see is that many organizations simply use the modern slavery statement as their main building block to say, as part of their due diligence assessment, if they have a modern slavery statement, and 9 times out of 10, it's beautifully crafted and wordsmithed by very articulate lawyers, and it ticks all the boxes in terms of compliance with the legislation, but in my view does very, very little to mitigating the likelihood of having slavery within your supply chain. And plus, the other issue around this, and it does make it difficult in terms of compliance, is that there's a limit. So if you have a company that's got more than 36 million turnover, they'll have a statement. But how do you address then the issue of the suppliers sitting underneath that?
Yeah.
That's where compliance then becomes difficult. And this is not about compliance, this is about doing the right thing. And so, yes, and I think in terms of procurement individuals, I think the problems landed in their lap, and other parts of the business see it as a procurement issue, but it's not. This is a company-wide issue. And my experience and talking to different procurement professionals is that they very often feel isolated in the fact that it's difficult to make these decisions with the limited availability of certain data and information that could be available in other parts of the business. And so I think the more advanced companies are the ones that work more holistically together and more joined up thinking around that. So yeah, I think the Act is a good thing, but I think it's time to revisit the Act and maybe provide more guidance. And I think one of the other things is that there's a lack of understanding around expectation.
Yeah.
In relation to the interpretation of what many suppliers don't actually understand what clients want around this.
And I think the when the Act was first put out in the UK, that is, it was deliberately fairly vague in not being too prescriptive of what it wanted organisations to do. And I think what it wanted was organisations to do their best efforts. But I think that has just led to people floundering a bit with not having much in the way of guidance. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. But saying that, it's not a new problem.
No.
You know, if you take the issue in the textile industry in the UK last year, that's not a new problem. We were looking at issues like that 15 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Hasn't really improved that much. So if you're vague in legislation, then companies will exploit that in some respects, and in some cases don't know if they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. I think there needs to be more guidance. There's certainly a lot of organizations out there that can provide that, and it doesn't always have to be something that you pay a lot of money for. I think there's a resource issue. I also think there's an issue around the quality of the data that's generated as part of the due diligence process, and that's something that, again, is not a new problem. And I think sometimes procurement guys are damned if they do, damned if they don't, because they're limited to what they can and can't procure in terms of quality of data.
And where might they go to get data on? I mean, and you briefly touched on it. You might have a bit of an understanding of what's going on with your tier one, but further down, and could data be the answer to that?
I think I take a step back from that and say, well, okay, the data, you need data to make educated purchasing decisions. That's a given. The reality is you have to question the quality of where that data's come from, how it's been evaluated, how it's been assessed. Is it historical? Is it current? What do you do with that data? And there is a problem. So what we're actually starting to see now is a greater reliance on technology as opposed to the traditional forms of doing audits and going out and doing desktop assessments, which have value but limited value. So we're now starting to see requests for sanction checking, greater levels of understanding of what local presses are saying and social media is saying about certain suppliers, and also issues around working with far more with the NGOs, that looking at things like anti-corruption and underage labour, etc. And one of the issues that we have at the moment is COVID, which seems to get the blame for everything, but it has impacted on this subject. Only 3 days ago, they announced 160 million children involved in supply chain activity, which is exacerbated in terms of COVID. So we need to be looking at the quality of the data and where it's coming from and how that is used and applied. And very often, if it's only applied to your strategic tier ones, very rarely is the problem there. The problem lies sitting below the tier ones. Yeah. And therein again lies another problem, because you don't have a contractual relationship with your tier twos, etc. So academic research has found that the best way of trying to get this is by enhancing your relationship with your tier ones in a more proactive way, whether that be preferred suppliers or better costings or whatever it might be. But I think the issue around assessing and evaluating the methods being used by your suppliers is paramount in the data that you're collecting, and also understanding where, if you're sourcing materials, where that stuff is coming from. Because if you're only sourcing it locally and they've produced you a statement saying we've done all our checks, fantastic, how do you know they have? Yeah. Where have they got those products from? Is it foreseeable that these have come from this location or that location where the probability of slavery is high? So if you know that, then you should be doing something about it, and not just saying, well, we've sourced it locally, we've done our checks, that's compliance, check the box. Yeah, you mentioned briefly there about having better relationships with suppliers and especially at that tier one, and probably more collaboration needs to go on with suppliers and within your own sector, perhaps even with your competitors, to try and address this. Yeah, particularly if you're a small organization, I guess you have limited influence. But you know what, Emma, they've been talking about collaboration for years. Yeah. And I think it's a great thing. I really do. But the reality is that the collaboration is only as good as other people willing to participate, and it doesn't always happen. I do think it's a good thing, but a lot of the data that we collect is applicable right across the board.
Yeah.
And if we could share that, I think there's value in that. I don't think there's any commercial disadvantage, especially in our sector, to sharing that information. And if it alleviates the issue and reduces the issue, because we'll never, all companies have modern slavery in their supply chain. That's the fact. So if we can reduce the likelihood of that, that's a positive. So yeah, I would go along. Yes, I would love to see greater collaboration. Unfortunately, you know, when these initiatives have tried, they never really took off for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think it's still a subject that people have reluctance to talk about openly as well. You know, like you say, everybody's got it in their supply chains. Are we happy to talk about it?
Sorry, I think the collaboration as well also needs to take place with client organizations. Because very often it's the client who drives this. And if the client organization doesn't wish to do that, there's some organizations in the UK who are absolutely superb. They're honest, they're open, they acknowledge these issues, and they tell people how they're dealing with it. And some of the work they're doing is outstanding. But there's others who don't, because they see it as a potential issue, especially now with the issue around ESG and top-down investment assessment of how you're managing your suppliers. They may see that as a black mark. But also collaboration needs to be done in-house as well, between departments. The number of times when I've worked on projects historically, I worked in HSE at the time, we didn't speak to procurement. Yet we, as individuals out on site all the time, could potentially see things that were happening that procurement would not know. So there needs to be greater talk and communication, which is, you know, this is not new, but it does need to happen. And if we could also see greater collaboration with clients, I think maybe our industry would follow, because it's in their interest to follow with the clients and work with the clients around that.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Mike. Well, stay with us, and we're going to introduce our panelists now as well. So I'd like to welcome our panelists on now, if they could switch your videos on. So we have Eirini Etoimou, who is Group Procurement Manager for Europe for Odeon Cinema Group, Alice Hands, Head of Ethical Sustainable Procurement at Sir Robert McAlpine, and Clare Jones, Group Procurement Director at Mace. Welcome, everybody.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us today. So I just wanted to kick off really, and Claire, maybe you could pick this one up. What steps you've taken really to address modern slavery in your supply chains?
Yeah, thanks Emma. So we at Mace have done quite a significant amount of work, as you'd expect, on this, but what we didn't want to do is for complacency to set in. So we have re-engaged with our strategic partners, and we've designed some workshops and some sessions, and we've re-emphasised that back to our strategic partners on modern slavery and things to look out for. We've also re-educated, and this is quite recent, this is this year, because obviously the Act came into play, as Mike said, a number of years ago, so we didn't want it to fall off. So we've re-engaged our supply chain with regard to modern slavery and what they look out for and what's happening out there. And we do a number of engagement sessions on each of our projects as well. We also do independent audits, and we have a dedicated industry relations lead that will do the audits on our sites and on our supply chain as well, to look out for that. So we are I think we're doing, you know, a significant amount to stop it. As Mike says, we're not going to eradicate it through all of our tiers of our supply chains, but we also do look at our tier ones and their second and third tiers as well.
Great. We'll come on to auditing a bit later in the discussion. Alice, welcome. Can you let us know a little bit about what you've been doing at Robert McAlpine?
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, we are McAlpine. It's obviously a contractor similar to Mace, and we've taken a similar approach. I think our focus predominantly has been around our UK site labour, and that was for one reason around awareness and education. And I mean, as Mike said, see, this has been around since before the Act, but especially in our industry, and there still is, there's a huge piece around awareness and education that actually it exists, and it's present, and it's it's a developed country problem as much as a non-developed country problem as well. So when we've educated our staff at sort of high level around, you know, what it is, and we're very much engaged with our supply chain. We use a third party to do audits, and yes, audits can come in for criticism, and rightly so if they're just a tick box. But for us, they serve a purpose, because we use them as also an engagement tool with our supply chain and an education tool. So we go out with our third party, so we don't just send the third party, but we go out with them. And we speak to our supply chain and we audit them in sort of two different ways, but we very much use it as a way to engage and educate on the topic as well. And it's not necessarily a pass-fail audit. It's about looking at our industry as and seeing how we can raise the bar as well. And I think, you know, education and awareness is key, and it might sound really obvious, but I often liken the journey that we've got to go on with the sort of modern slavery to perhaps what we've done with health and safety. You know, 20 years ago, I mean, I wasn't in the industry 20 years ago, but 20 years ago, I think it was much more hush-hush about health and safety. You know, people wouldn't speak up. You know, we're now in a space, hopefully, where people are far more comfortable about to raise a concern about health and safety. And that's where we need to get to with labour standards and labour practices, and because that's how criminals benefit. They benefit from the opaqueness, the fact that people are a bit scared to speak up. So we need to go on that journey in terms of awareness and people feeling comfortable that they can raise their hand. Absolutely,
thank you, Eirini.
So from our side in Odeon, and because we operate in 9 countries across Europe, we have a very, very strict and robust and holistic approach, I would say, that covers the modern slavery eradication proactively and reactively. So we have a very, very specific policy in place, so all the colleagues know what they should be expected to do when they need to select suppliers. We train, and we're working very closely with our supply chain, and at the same time it is a part of our tender process, the contracts, the risk management, the supplier relationship management in general. And we have also then internal audits that is part of all this discussion.
We talked briefly with Mike before you joined us about data sources, and what can you let us know what tools or sources of data that you use to just, because sometimes it's establishing like where your highest risks are, where to focus your efforts, and do you rely on data sources for that? Alice, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I would say you can't tackle everything at once, and be really aware of that, and you know, take a risk-based approach, but be aware that, you know, your risks you should be agile about them. They will change. And I would say if anyone's sort of starting out in this, it's not an exact science. Don't worry necessarily about getting it right, because when you start investing, going to supply chain learning, that will inform your sort of journey from then. And that's certainly been our case. So, and again, have a varied toolbox, I suppose, for want of another word. Don't just rely on audits. Don't just rely on data. Use a mix of things. I would say, and Chris Harrop from Marshalls, if anyone knows him, will always say this: there is nothing that compensates about, get out into your supply chain. There's nothing that replaces that physically. When you can, get out into your supply chain, because that is really when you start seeing sort of what's going on. But combine that with data. There's things like the Global Slavery Index that ranks countries on prevalence of modern slavery. The US have a list of goods that is linked to source country, enforced and child labour. Now that's not obviously UK list, but that could, when you're sourcing materials, that can help inform you. So I think often people look for, one solution to risk profile, but I don't think there is. And, risks constantly change. So it's about using that varied toolbox and having multiple different ways of engaging with your supply chain, and then sort of risk profiling your supply chain as well.
Thank you. Claire, similar story for you, and have, as a sector, have you been collaborating at all and sharing information, etc., in the construction sector?
Yes, I mean, yeah, we do, and very similar to what Alice has said, it's getting out there when you are able to do so. You know, there's nothing better than getting out to talking to your suppliers, going into their factory, walking around, talking to their staff. You know, it's relatively easy to get a piece of paper. You actually want to get out there. And my view is, if something doesn't feel right, it generally isn't right. So just do some more investigation. But Alice and myself and a few others of our peers discuss these items, and our health and safety leads as well also have a forum. And we look at this across the sector, because it's not, you know, it's better to share issues, and rather than just hiding them and putting them under the carpet. We're all having the same issues. We're generally using a very similar supply chain. Both Alice and our organisation do very similar schemes, work in very similar locations. So it's better to share the issues when they become apparent. But key for me is getting out there, and our industrial relations, modern slavery guys is out there all of the time. You know, clearly not being able to do as much as we would have liked to do during the pandemic, but as things ease slightly, we're actually going out there to meet with our suppliers and doing that hands-on discussions there.
Great. Eirini, what do you use data sources of where to establish where your highest risks are? How do you use tools like that?
It depends on, because we have a really wide variety of supply chain. For us, it is construction, it is food and beverage, it is professional services. So there is a very thorough risk mitigation, and we're trying to identify the areas that we could possibly have this type of issues. And I will definitely agree and echo what Alice and Claire just mentioned, that it is not just collating data and say, for example, that X percentage of my supply chain comply, because everybody can tick a box in a pre-qualification questionnaire, isn't it? But the important is, as also Mike said, who is doing the right thing. So the closest we work with the suppliers, and if we can have this more physical, let's say, audit and presence for our supply chain, then we realize exactly what is happening. And personally, and even in previous professional life, I have experienced this in different countries, where what I found visiting factories was significantly different from what I had as data in my inbox.
And how receptive are suppliers to working with you on things like this, Eirini? You know, are they welcoming you in and working hard and being as open as possible?
Well, the level and the quality of how receptive the suppliers are to support us achieving the transparency and ethics in our supply chains depends predominantly on their business size, awareness, and their personal interest.
Yeah.
So where the big national or global players can at least comply with the laws, no matter if they are UK, EU, or if they adopt the UN goals. And moreover, they can exhibit actions to eradicate modern slavery in their supply chains. So in this way, indirectly supporting our goals. For smaller companies, there is still the impression that modern slavery does not exist. Or if it does, then it is something and somewhere that happens very, very far away from us. And additionally, the legal compliance and the turnover threshold has an awareness impact, as well as creates a pushback from those that either have no visibility of their supply chains, they have no awareness of what modern slavery is, and may feel also intimidated of what they would be required to do with it, and how their relationships with the customer would possibly be affected.
Yeah, Mike, I guess you see a lot of that, like suppliers being maybe reluctant to have those conversations, or be less open, or even scared to divulge what's going on?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is most suppliers simply don't understand what the client's expectations are, because the clients aren't very good at explaining it. And something that because we get a lot of supplier pushback, because they say, well, it doesn't affect us. We don't have a turnover of X, or we're only a small business. The most successful companies that we work with have massive education programs, and it sounds expensive the way I say it, but it's not. It adds value, because it actually helps educate the companies as to what they're looking for. And I mean, if you look at some of the initiatives that are being undertaken in the UK currently, with like the Gangmaster Association Authority, etc., they're really, really proactive, and they help explain things in simple language, because it's you know, similar to the scenario given about health and safety. You know, it is something now that companies do understand a much better level, not exactly, but better than it was. And the same with modern slavery and underage labor. I think it is about education, and I think it's about explaining it in simple terms. And like I say, the clients that we've seen that have been successful in this initiative are the ones who have been very clear. If they're asking questions in their due diligence process, there's supportive guidance explaining, these are our expectations, this is what we expect you to do, these are the reasons why we want to ask this question. And if it becomes like that, it then becomes more of a partnership or alliance rather than a beating with a big stick.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a question through relating to this, and I'll put it out to Claire and Alice. In the construction sector, you're obviously working further down the tiers with lots of very small organisations, and how practical is it, or how do you get through to smaller organisations who don't necessarily have the staff to be able to do these checks and balances or focus on it as much as you'd like? Alice, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, that's a problem, and obviously getting the transparency down through your supply chain. So you've got to start with your tier ones, but by doing that, you engage with them, and then you move to tier two. So it's a process. It takes time. What I would say in terms of sort of SMEs or much smaller companies is, again, I think, like sort of Mike mentioned right at the start about how modern slavery is viewed, and is it a procurement issue, is it not? It's not. It's heavily linked to health, safety and well-being, which is now what we often refer to. So these companies, especially if they're working in construction or on our construction projects, they will have health and safety measures. So you're not necessarily asking them to do something new, but you're asking them to use maybe a process they've already got, or an initiative they've already got, and build into it something around some labour exploitation on slavery. They don't necessarily have to invent something new, and there are so many tools out there, free tools and education that they can access. So, one of the things that we do is point them to that. We have an initiative, a sort of organisation in our industry called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. There's lots of free tools they can use on that. So, yeah, it is a challenge, but we've spoken about the Modern Slavery Act and the threshold that's in it. Obviously, only companies that have a turnover of £36 million or more have to write a statement. But actually, the way the Act is written, that it should draw in all those companies, regardless. They might not have to write a statement, but for businesses that are over 36 million, the way that Act is written, we should be drawing in businesses from all over our supply chain. So while you might not be looking for a statement, you're looking for actions and initiatives that they're doing.
And I guess it goes back to that clarity, isn't it? And making sure that they understand exactly what it is that you're looking for. Claire, how do you help smaller organisations signpost them to toolkits, etc.?
Yes, it's similar to Alice. We've got the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which has loads of really good data on there. But because we've educated our tier ones, we can share that data further down their supply chain. And I think you might, as Alice has said, you've got to break it into bite-sized chunks. We don't want people to be afraid of this. And it's also letting people think for themselves. If something doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right, and raise it with somebody, escalate it. And then, you know, people aren't afraid to help. So I think that's key. Don't be afraid. Look for help, and there's loads, you know, if you did any Google searches, there's loads of advice and information on there that the SMEs and the smaller companies can actually find. Yeah,
we'll share some of the CIPS toolkits as well in the chat in a bit, because there's some great stuff that you can share in your own organisations or in your supply chains as well. I'm going to dive a bit deeper into the supplier, the third-party auditing. And we've had a few questions come through from this about just how often you do it, who you contract with, how effective you're finding it. Alice, do you want to take that one first?
Yep, so we've been doing it for about a number of years now anyway, and we started off quite small. And as I said before, by doing a sort of our initial pilot program, that then informed us particular trades that perhaps we wanted to look at more so than others. We don't have a necessarily set time frame that we go back to a particular subcontractor. It depends again on that audit, what was originally looked at, and we're concentrating on extending that program across our supply chain. And again, it very much depends what the result of the audit is, if there's any sort of areas for improvement, how we go back to them. But I mean, if we go back regularly, we're in contact with them, that audit program very much informs us where perhaps we might want, you know, to look next, or, you know, we might have thought that a certain area of the supply chain was high risk, but we might discover perhaps another area it is. And all those things we've learned, that we've gained through sort of getting out into to our supply chain. And also we constantly review the sort of audit questions and what we're asking. It's not a sort of it's not as, you know, point in time that audit has to be used for the next year. If we think we need to adapt those questions, ask something different, then we will. If a particular project has a particular need, we'll adapt it. And I think that's a really important thing, is you need to be agile and you need to be prepared to sort of flex and change something if it's either not working, or if you've got some more intelligence. And as I said, you know, if at the moment we're learning, you know, we're looking through our supply chain in a lens that perhaps we hadn't done before a number of years ago, especially our industry. And, you know, we're learning lots about the supply chain in a different way that we haven't necessarily, because we haven't looked at them through that lens before. So as long as the audits are informing us, we're gaining information, where, you know, there's areas we might need to improve on, they serve a purpose. When they all start coming back, you know, perfect, or we're not learning anything, that's when I would look at them and say either they're not serving the purpose or we need to change them as well.
Yeah, and Mike, you mentioned that, you know, auditing is just one of the tools in our armory to draw on. What advice would you give to people who are considering audits?
Yeah, I think the primary thing I would look at, the vast majority of audit programs have announced audits, which basically says, hey, we're going to be here in 2 weeks. So that means you've got 2 weeks to put everything right. My personal experience is the companies that have had the most success is using the unannounced approach, where you turn up without warning, and you then can actually see you've got a far better indicator of what could happen. And that is a flaw in with many of the ethical auditing programs that are out there looking at this subject, is that they're announced and it gives companies time to put things right. And if you think about it logically, if someone is doing something wrong, they're not going to have that there, you know. And there's warning signs as well. You turn up on site and everyone's got crisp PPE on, and you know that's only issued last night, you know, and things like that. Our clients at the moment tend to be looking at things annually, and I think that is mainly because they've just started the journey, and I think that will slowly become more widespread. There is no pass-fail. We strongly advise against having a pass-fail in this approach. Many clients want it, and we do our best to persuade otherwise. If we find things wrong, it's then making sure you put sensible action plans in place to close these out and make them realistic and suitable for the demographic of supplier. Because if there are small suppliers, they're not going to have the resources to put all singing, all dancing systems or programs in place. It has to be specific to that supplier, and it may be something really simple. The one thing I don't do, and I know it's been mentioned a couple of times, is point people in the direction of the internet. Some of these smaller companies, they struggle with the internet, you know, and very often than not, they don't have the time, because especially if it's a small family business, that those individuals doing everything from invoicing to safety to doing the actual work out on site. So I think we have to be a little bit more proactive in actually giving information, and also undertaking paid attendance at workshops and webinars. We're starting to see that with some of our clients in Australia now, and it's actually paying dividends because there's more participation, because they know they're not losing money, and they're coming in and they're actually participating. And that then comes to the original point of the training, etc. But my one key takeaway here is if you're doing any type of audit, try if possible to do unannounced, and also look at the competence of the individual. The primary area of getting information of quality data is worker interviews, and not everybody has the ability to do that. There are some excellent auditors who can find things wrong in systems, but actually speaking to individuals and obtaining data that can lead you down other rabbit holes to find things wrong, that's a skill set on its own. And it's all about the quality of the individual who's undertaking the auditing as well, irrelevant of location.
Yeah, good advice. Eirini, have you had experience of audits and how effective they are? And kind of what kind of frequency are you flagging issues that come up through your audits?
In the current professional life, we have the internal audit, and so far, because I mentioned before about the risk management, seems that we have a low risk, but we continuously monitoring what is happening in the supply chain. However, in previous professional life, and being associated predominantly and heavily relied on specific countries, we needed to use auditors, and we used them unannounced approach as well, because we had very specific concerns about factories with children labor and the labor conditions. So before we find to the situation and say that we stop with the supplier, we needed to ensure if we can do something about it, because our thought was not just to audit and remove the specific supplier, but not to turn the backs to these people that were affected, and see if we could impose terms and conditions to the supplier in order to ensure that they can improve these people's lives. So it was not only about the supplier, but to think it think the bigger picture, that these people's lives that are affected, not just an account from the supplier. So yes, it was effective because we managed to have really important information data that we took actions. Based on the risk is also the frequency. So obviously it could be just once a year if it is a medium risk, low medium, but if there are specific concerns, definitely that would require considerably more.
And Claire, what about when you do get some red flags through audits? What kind of remedial action do you take with suppliers when you've identified a problem?
Yeah, we obviously speak to the suppliers. We talk to them and get them to understand what the issue is. They may not realise themselves, so it's just making sure that they understand what they've been doing. As I think Eirini said, you can't just stop them working for you because you could be exasperating the problem. There's no point just terminating their contract because that problem's going to happen somewhere else. So you've got to take a responsibility to help them work through it. They may not realise it, you know, that they may not have picked up the red flags, but there's nothing worse than just stopping their workflow. You've got to, you know, because they could have a family, there's lots of things that could affect it, and you just can't afford just to, you know, if you were looking at this 10 years ago, I can imagine people would have just said, right, that's it, they're not working for us any longer. And that clearly can't be the right answer. And I think, as Mike said, you've got to put some plans in place to help them turn it around, and they've got to be manageable and smart objectives and plans there. It can't be unsurmountable. It can't be, you know, a massive task. They have to be achievable, and you have to work with them. And yes, if they do nothing to turn things around and it still happens, then the disciplinary and the end would have to, you'd have to look at that option, but you can't just do that immediately. You've got to help them and work with them.
And Alice, what kind of remedial action have you put in place? Do you make it time bound in what you expect from people and how they turn things around?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends on what it is and the severity of it. But it's always time bound. We follow up. We give them a certain time frame, and then we go back in there and talk to them about it. But it's dependent on what the issue is that's been raised, and how is it with them or is it in their supply chain as well. So sometimes you have to, you then link in with the tier 2 or the tier 3, and we don't have a contractual relationship with those tiers. So again, how you deal and how you manage that is quite different, and you should, I would say, take your tier 1s on that journey with you. But as Claire said, yeah, if you just extract yourself from a supply chain and think, okay, we've solved it, that someone else will just fill that gap, and it's not going to solve that problem. And I also think that's how some of these, if it's criminal gangs, it's how they survive, because they think, oh, okay, we might be shut down there, but we can carry on going there, and it adds to the sort of opaqueness and lack of transparency of what is going on. So if companies are more open and can speak about it and potentially safe forums, then again you start to break down those barriers that actually aid exploiters and enable them to operate.
And Mike, do you think it's still clear for what organisations should do when they find an issue in their supply chain, who they should turn to, who they should report it to, as well as those conversations with suppliers?
It's an interesting question. I think internally, I think that's pretty. I think the people we've spoken to and we deal with, they all have very robust networks internally. I think externally in the UK, I think we're pretty lucky. And we have certain organisations that are pretty proactive and react very, very quickly when we do report. I know historically I've reported 2 incidents and they were acted upon within 24 hours. So I think yes, in the United Kingdom, yes. In other parts of the world, maybe not so, because in some cases, some of the things that we may think are wrong may be deemed culturally acceptable in those locations where you're auditing. So maybe they don't deem the need for a reporting structure. But I think in the UK, I think we're pretty lucky in the fact that we have pretty good organisations, and with the forthcoming changes with the merging of the different organisations coming into the one form of inspectorate that's going to happen. I don't know how effective that will be or if that will impact on it. I know Gangmaster is joining with other organisations, but my experience of them has been exemplary, and some of the things they found have been outstanding. So I think as a country, we're very lucky that we companies know, and everyone I've dealt with in procurement and in HSC all know where to go to. So I think, yes, in answer to your question, yes.
Great. Alice, I touched briefly talking about this with Mike about since the Modern Slavery Act came in place, I mean, it has put the issue firmly on everyone's radar. But do you think that organisations are doing their best efforts, or do you still think that perhaps some procurement teams and organisations are still looking at this from a compliance point of view rather than really bottoming out their good governance and reviewing their processes, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, in short, yes. I think you will always get a breadth of response, won't you, from organisations. There's some really good ones out there, and there's some really ones that, I mean, aren't even like FTSE companies that aren't even legally compliant. So I think there's a breadth. I mean, when the Modern Slavery Act came out, it's come in for criticism lately because it's, has it got teeth? Has anyone actually been prosecuted in failure of compliance? I don't think that they have. I think it was actually, the intention was always there to try and raise and do best practice. But and you've got some good examples out there. For us, it was when it came out, it was quite quickly that we didn't just want to comply. We say we want to actively respond to it.
Yeah.
But yes, I definitely think you can see some statements that basically are a page long and say in 6 different ways we don't agree with modern slavery. And you can see some very good ones out there, and I think with the consultation on the act last year and the results of that at some point will be put into law, will really strengthen it, and will mean that companies will really have to sort of increase what they're doing and really be explicit in areas where they're not not doing things. So I think hopefully we'll see a change in how and as you remember, your statements write retrospectively, so those changes are coming in. So you need to start, if you're not doing what you should be, start looking now, because you write your statement retrospectively.
And Claire, I think the wider sustainability agenda is becoming a business imperative rather than a nice to have. So really, organisations have really got to start getting a handle on this, surely.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that's why we've re-engaged this year into as part of our wider sustainability plans. We're talking net zero carbon. We've got the modern methods of construction, keeping people off site, and modern slavery is just one of those things that's wrapped into this, and it's included within all of our terms and conditions. So all of our supply chain understands the importance of this and our other wider sustainability targets that we again are sharing and including our supply chain in that.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, it's a leverage for winning business as well as attracting talent. So yeah, absolutely on everyone's radar. Right, I'm going to quickly run through some of the questions that have come through. And we've had a couple about how hard is it to get internal stakeholders or that internal buy-in to realise that this is a big issue, and I guess to increase the buy-in and the urgency, and actually to get some resource behind it. Have you anyone experienced any struggle in your organisations to get buy-in and the resources you need?
I can start with that. So no, we've got a group, and our deputy chairman actually chairs that, and he's leading the charge on this across our business. So we've got some real senior buy-in. I sit part of that group along with one of our managing directors, and it looks across the whole of the global business. We focus on the UK because that's where we do most of the actual works. We do consultancy works outside of the UK, but we've got it at the top table. It's on the agenda, and it's driving through from the top. So we aren't having any struggles, but I appreciate others may do.
Eirini, has it been easy to get the buy-in in the organisation that you work for now and other organisations?
It was also something similar, that until a few years ago, modern slavery was something that was very far away from us. It was only for the garment industry. So, and predominantly it was driven only by people that were interested in this. But gradually, of course, we started educating our senior management and our colleagues in order to make them understand why it is important, what modern slavery is. And I can say now, and I'm very proud that our senior management, all our executive committee, is fully committed and dedicated. But not every company is like this, and I have seen and experienced this, that modern slavery was something that, it was just something that I was passionate about, and people thought that it is just an exaggeration and not an actual issue.
Yeah, and there's a question, I guess, for me that's come up about what CIPS is doing to raise awareness with senior stakeholders. And I think when I think I came back from maternity leave in about 2011, and someone said, "Oh, Emma, we need you to work on this campaign on modern slavery," and I was like, "What?" And I everyone was quite surprised at the time. And when we started first talking about it, I think people had thought we'd gone mad, because this issue had really gone under everyone's radar. and we worked quite a lot with the press to raise awareness of the issue and make sure that it sits on people's radar, and particularly not only, but sits with procurement. I know that it's a company-wide initiative, but really the buck stops with us.
And if you consider also how many issues we have seen exploding only at, or the biggest advocates of the modern slavery eradication are the companies that were exposed with significant scandals, and then they started being open, being transparent, and working actually based on this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of other questions. Would you audit all of your tier 1 suppliers, or those that are critical or on a risk-based approach? Right. Anybody want?
I'll jump in. I'll say, you know, as I think I said before earlier, you can't target everything at one time. You've got to take you just can't. So you have to take some form of approach and assess your supply chain, you know, on a risk base, but you know, using different metrics and start there. And as I said, that will sometimes help you then inform areas that you then want to go. But I wouldn't, you know, don't try and attack the whole pie at once, because it will just be too overwhelming. I would start somewhere and then increase that, and then the knowledge that you gain from that will help inform perhaps where you want to go next. And I think, as Claire mentioned, you know, before, we're part of sort of industry groups that link into government, that link into enforcement agencies, and all that. And you get the type of intelligence and information you get from that can then vastly help you inform where you might want to look, you know, as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Mike, I've had a question through. To what extent would a risk assessment vary for goods versus services? I mean, you know, Eirini mentioned briefly that, you know, some service sectors probably thought they were, you know, clear of all this kind of risks.
Yeah, interesting. The way our clients tend to identify, because it ties into the previous question as well, is in terms of the companies that are coming onto site, the contractors that are working on site, they tend to look at work activity and they base it around their activity, and they then evaluate the level of risk based on that. And in terms of suppliers, the risk matrix approach that they use is more around location, probability of slavery, and that's how they categorize the type of risk, and also where they sit within the supply chain. I don't think there's a silver bullet for this, and I've seen lots of different methodologies of assessing the risk, but the one that seems to come up the most is people still put people in the high, medium, low, and focus their attention on the high risk suppliers, and then they finite those to a different level based around what they do, where they're based, and size of company. I mean, I can't give a more complex answer than that, because it's still, most people do it at a pretty basic level.
Yeah.
And it's quite a subjective process as well, in terms of, you know, you have to base it on the data that you can obtain. And we're quite lucky in the fact that we can obtain pretty good quality of data based on technology. But again, it is quite subjective.
Great. And I've had a question about, you know, how you go about evaluating tier 3 suppliers. I mean, you're going quite down the supply chain there. Has anyone got any experience they want to share on that, going down that far on assessing and evaluating suppliers that far down the supply chain?
I mean, all I would say is the principles of what you're trying to do don't change. It doesn't matter how big an organization is, but the principles of what you're looking at are the same. Yes, how you might interact with them, because if you're not in direct contact with them, will differ, and obviously their size, they're likely to be smaller, will potentially differ. But the principles of what you're trying to achieve and the standards, you know, talking about labour practices, human rights, don't change. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. Just because a company is small, you don't compromise your principles for that. But yeah, how you might interact. So, you know, we've kind of looking at our tier 2s quite a lot in terms of labour agencies, and we're doing that in collaboration with our tier 1s. That's the only reason. That's the only way you get to know who they are.
Yep.
You've got to start, you've got to map that first, and then go to them.
And also we should consider that, and also we should consider that depending on the complexity of the supply chain, and if we are facing the deep tiering, that the length of this supply chain could create also the lack of visibility, because it's not always easy to do it. Let's be pragmatic as well. And not always do we have the leverage in the next tiers. Could create these issues. So no matter how good intentions we have, our visibility and our actions could be no more than level 3.
Yeah.
Then things become a little bit more less visible, less pragmatic and realistic.
Mike, I'll give you the last word there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I've never really seen many successful programs that have gone past tier 2. One of the big flaws that I have seen is that the many programs apply the same program that they do to their tier 1s, their tier 2, 3s, and so on, and that doesn't always help because it's not relative to the size of the supplier, and in many cases they don't have to comply with you, because you may be one of thousands of clients, sorry. Yeah. So I think it has to be relative, and I think it's about engagement, and it's about engagement with the previous supply chain. I think the retail sector, despite some of the issues that they've had, I think they have that pretty good, the way they do that. And a lot of the time it's because when they're auditing their tier 1s, and there has to be a lot of trust here, is they seek information on who they are subcontracting to. And I understand the flaws behind that and the potential issues with that, but where it has been successful and there's been the element of trust, it's then been able to be cascaded to the tier 2 successfully, and then obviously the tier 3. But I've very rarely come across many where there's been a huge amount of success because of the lack of relationships with them. Great.
Okay, we are completely out of time. Thank you so much for everyone who submitted their questions, and thank you to our panelists as well, Alice, Claire, Eirini and Mike. Thank you very much for joining us today. So that wraps us up. I'm just about to share a link in the chat for some resources that you can find on the CIPS website that might help you with this. And this session is being recorded, and as we mentioned, we will send you a link to that and any of the other Avetta sponsored sessions that we've held before now that you can catch up on if you didn't catch those when they were aired. So thank you very much. We've had great chat, great engagement on such an important topic, and we hope to see you again soon.